This is quite short. You could learn this one off by heart, probably even before the sermon's over. But Psalm 130, are we all there? Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. More than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. You may be familiar with this psalm. I call it out of the depths. The ESV calls it my soul waits for the Lord. The commentator Leupold, he gives it a Latin name, De Profundis, from the depths. If you look at Luther's Bible and you want the German, it's Aus der Tiefe. I like that, Aus der Tiefe, from the depths. I can see someone recognizes it immediately. So any of this, that's just a little to lead us in, out of the depths. And that really is my first point, the depths, out of your depths. I can remember a long time ago, at least 53 years, I was at Bradford-on-Avon swimming pool. That's where I grew up. I'd learned to swim at about the age of 11. So I was allowed to go by myself to the swimming pool, which wasn't much bigger than a large bathtub in those days. It's about 5'6" deep at the deep end. Does that mean anything to you? About 1.53, something like that. 1.53 meters. That's all it was. That's the deep end. And the shallow end, well, it hardly went over your ankles. And it wasn't very long. It wasn't as big as this chapel. But there I was. I'd learnt to swim. And there was this young lad, 2 or 3 years younger than me, was still in the junior school. And I was watching him, and I knew he couldn't swim. And he was jumping in the deep end. And he was jumping in and using his natural buoyancy just to come up again and grab the bar, pull himself out. And he kept doing this, coming back, jumping. I was watching him. And I thought, he can't swim. And I like this little lad. I remembered him from my previous school. I was watching him. And one time, he jumped just a bit too far away from the edge. And when he came up, he couldn't reach the bar. I saw him floundering. I just gave him a shove so he could grab the bar. The lifeguard wasn't in the pool at that point. He was out in his office. That wouldn't be allowed now. But if I or someone hadn't been watching, that little fellow probably wouldn't be a grown man today. So my first point is this: the depths, already out of your depths. We don't know who wrote this psalm. Sounds a bit like David, but we don't really know who wrote it. But surely, even if you don't know who wrote it, or even exactly why he wrote it, as you read this psalm, can't you identify with the writer when he says, out of the depths, out of my depths? Have you ever thought of that to yourself? I'm out of my depth in here. And you don't mean the swimming pool. You mean with what you're facing, what you've got to do. Or someone said to you, and they can see that you've got something to look after, some responsibility. You're out of your depth, aren't you? Has anybody ever said that to you? You're out of your depth. You might have said it to yourself. Yeah? Maybe it's work. You landed a new job and you thought it was so great, and you suddenly realize, I'm out of my depth, and everybody else can see it too. Or maybe it's family things. you've got married and you realize you're out of your depth. Or you've got your growing family, you've had your first or second child and you realize, the water's rather deep here. Perhaps, especially in this climate, you think of people with their mortgages leaping up when they come up for renewal, and you think, I'm out of my depth. I took on a mortgage I thought I could handle, or some other financial commitment. I'm out of my depth. I can't pay that and my electricity and gas bills. Maybe you're out of your depth because of physical problems. You're suddenly overtaken with an illness, or there's a progressive illness, and now you've been coping, but you find now you're out of your depth, or an accident, or maybe even an addiction. You thought you could manage it, and you can't now. Or perhaps you're overtaken by depression, and you feel like you're down a well. You're out of your depths. Have you ever been there? In the pits? Do you ever say that? I'm in the pits. Out of my depth. In depression. Some people, they're so much out of their depth in life, they don't want to live. They're suicidal. Or at least they run away from life. Do you remember the MP who faked his death by drowning and disappeared and came up somewhere in Australia? I don't think he swam all the way there. He was overwhelmed. Do you recognize the experience of this psalmist? He's overwhelmed. Do you ever feel overwhelmed? In need of the strong arm of friendly support and help. Well, perhaps you've been there in the past, and now for you it's a distant memory. You say, I'm never going there again. Well, don't be so sure. You say, I'm never going there again. Or maybe you're young enough for it not to have been your experience yet. And you think, oh no, what's he talking about? I haven't really been overwhelmed. I can cope. Perhaps even as a Christian, you like to think you're a coper. You're a survivor. You're no wimp. You're never out of your depth. And even if you were, you wouldn't let anybody else know. But maybe today, even, you are in the pits. Maybe you're feeling out of your depth in some way right now, or at least dreading something that's coming down the road and when you know you will be. This psalmist, he is writing to encourage others overwhelmed as they walk through life's troubled path. And you know, there comes an experience for every human being, because that is the human life. When he or she is overwhelmed. What did that man Eliphaz say? We're born to trouble. Born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. So whoever you are here today, young or old, an established Christian, or just beginning to find out something more about God and Bible and church and that sort of thing, this psalm is for you. So that's for all of us. So out of your depths, you know about that. But here we see, secondly, a cry from the depths. Out of the depth I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Just in case you didn't get the point. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. Well, I told you about that swimming pool incident. 2 or 3 years later, Bradford-on-Avon had got a new swimming pool, much larger. And there I was in the swimming pool, about halfway along. And then suddenly the lifeguard on the side, who was fully dressed, he pointed over my shoulder and said, bring him over here. And I looked round and this whale went up. I don't mean a whale like a seagoing creature. I mean a howl, a cry. I turned around and there was this young lad, and he'd been flapping around and not realizing he couldn't swim, and he got too far away and he was suddenly out of his depth. And this howl went up, and the lifeguard was wanting me to poke him out of the pool because he didn't want to get his clothes wet. So there I was again, doing my lifeguard bit, no lifeguard training. Just got hold of him. No one else had done that. Just got hold of him and dragged him to the side and hooked him out. But the point is, there was that wail for help, that howl, that cry for help. And this is what the psalmist is doing. There's a howl going up, a wail, a cry, because he's overwhelmed. That sense of being overwhelmed, it moves people to cry, doesn't it? Suddenly, when you're overwhelmed, you cry out like crazy. You can't stop yourself. Even those who seem the most self-controlled, they're the least vocal. Suddenly, that howl goes up. You might say, well, what's the point of crying to someone who isn't there? You can't see them, you can't hear them, probably isn't even there at all. But, crying out to God really is the best thing you can do when you're in trouble. The Bible is full, absolutely full of encouragements to cry out to God because he hears and answers. And it's full of promises and encouragements. It's also full of examples of people who cry out to God for help, and he answers. We don't know how God always works. We can't see what his invisible hands are doing behind the scene, but he certainly works in physical and spiritual ways. Remember, tuck this verse away for a dark day. Psalm 55, verse 15. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you. Don't forget the last bit. And you shall glorify me. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. Psalm 55, verse 15. Now, when I say that God answers that cry for prayer, this cry out of the depths, we let up this cry, I'm not saying that God's there as our crutch. Some people think that God is just like a crutch, just there when you need it. Do anybody know the story of Aladdin? Yeah, and he had this, he rubbed his lamp, and this genie, this spirit would appear and say, yes, master, what's your wish? What do you want me to do? God's not like that. There just to meet our wishes. And that we can dismiss him when he starts asking uncomfortable questions. But he does answer those who cry out to him in sincerity from their very heart. Listen to these verses from Psalm 107. Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters. They see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep, for he commands and raises the stormy wind, which lifts up the waves of the sea. They mount up to the heavens. They go down again to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man. Then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that his waves are still. Then they are glad because they're quiet. So he guides them to their desired haven. Well, Kidner says, self-help is no answer to the depths of distress, however useful in the shallows of self-pity. Did you get that? Self-help. You can't help. You just got to cry out. Matthew Henry says, in the greatest depths, it is our privilege that we may cry to God and be heard. A prayer may reach the heights of heaven out of the greatest troubles we may be in this world. And perhaps you can think of people. Jeremiah, when he was thrown in a dungeon and he cried out to God. Maybe you think of Daniel thrown into that den of lions. Jonah in the belly of the fish. And they all cried out to God and he delivered them. In your pit, whatever that may be, whenever that may be, cry out to God himself. Others may come to your help as well, but your greatest need is the help of the Lord. Do you know what it is, seriously, to lift your heart and your voice to God in your time of need? So, out of your depths, a cry from the dead. But I see there in verse 3, so perhaps what's really at the core of this psalm. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, who could stand? And that tells me about the darkness of the depths. Out of depths, a cry from the depths, the darkness of the depths. You know, it's bad enough to be in the pits because of some terrible responsibility or some illness or some family problem or financial problem. It's bad enough to be overwhelmed by such trouble. But what so often makes the experience of our personal depths so dark and so overwhelming, so full of despondency, is a guilty conscience. The awareness of our sin, of our personal iniquities. I'm not saying that every overwhelming experience that we go through is always the direct result of personal sin. I'm not saying that. Certainly it might be. It might be. It isn't always the case. But what is so often the case is that when we go through desperate moments, our consciences are quickened and things come to mind. It causes us, these overwhelming experiences, cause us to reflect on the fact that we're sinners. They bring to mind past sins. That's why I read from 1 Kings 17. That wonderful provision that God made for that widow, that Elijah should come and stay in her house. And she thought she was going out to cook her last meal, or get some sticks to cook her last meal. And who should she meet but Elijah? And he comes to stay, and never again need she worry about meal, flour, and oil to provide for herself and her son and her household. Never again. But her son gets ill. And you know the story, right? You know, the son gets ill, and then you just think, oh, well, then Elijah prays for him and gets better. But no, what did she say to Elijah? What have you against me? Have you come to remind me of my sin? To bring it to remembrance and cause the death of my son. So often, that is our experience. Don't you find that? I find it. Something dreadful's happened, not because of necessarily of something I've immediately done wrong, but it sets thoughts going. I thought, what a horrible thing someone's done to me. But actually, I've been like that myself, and it reminds me of my sin or my foolishness, whatever it is. Now, maybe the psalmist wasn't going through a particular external experience. Maybe the very pit, the depth he's talking about is plain old conviction of sin, plain old feeling guilty. He's suddenly become aware of how he and his sins appeared to God. You know, not even the most agnostic person, the most atheistic person can escape the fact that we are rational, moral beings, that we have a sense of right and wrong. The youngest very soon show that they have a sense of right and wrong. Very, very, very soon. You know when you're doing wrong. It's written all over your face sometimes, even however young. I can remember when I was telling lies, and I was younger than you two at the back there, much younger than you two, and I can remember telling lies to get myself out of a scrape. I can remember no one had to teach me to be unkind to my sister. And I was younger than you, Liam. Yeah, I knew what it was. Yeah, and things come back, don't they? They remind you, oh, how awful. Well, he was aware of his sin. We've all got these guilty secrets, those guilty memories, haven't you? We've all lied or lusted, hated, cheated, gossiped, even if we haven't done the more violent things. And not one of us loves God with heart and mind and soul and strength. Can you look God in the eye and say you've always loved him with all your being? Can you say you've always loved your neighbor as yourself? We all know surely what it is to suddenly be smitten with the memory of some deed, some word, even some thought we thought long years ago. I have that experience. Suddenly something comes back to me from 60 years ago. And it's just as much a sin now as it was then when I did it. It's no less a sin in God's sight. And it's overwhelming. You know, guilty memories drive some people to drink, drugs, suicide, because they can't live with their guilt. And that's what the psalmist is finding. He says, oh Lord, if you should mark iniquities, who could stand? And that word mark, it means put a hedge round with thorns. Guard it so that you keep it safe. Always in you, the Lord should always make sure there's a hedge all around my sins, so they're always in your view and no one can scatter them, so they're all forgotten. Oh, how can I stand if you always got your eye on everything I've done, thought, and said that's wrong? Those guilty secrets, we want them all forgotten, don't we? Hidden away. We want them scattered like dust, never to be seen, out of sight, never to be mentioned again. But try as we might, we can never completely erase them from conscience. And the psalmist is saying, oh Lord, if you always see them, if you've always got a hedge around them so that no one can hide them away, if you're always guarding them with your watchful eye on them, how can I stand before you? How can I live with myself? That even the secrets of my heart are all intimately known to you is more than I can bear, is really what he's saying. I personally can't bear their memory after long years, he's saying. And will your gaze be on them for all eternity? Now you say to me, this is so gloomy. Stop tormenting my soul. But I say to you, keep reading the psalm, because this is the road that leads to forgiveness. So here we have it. Out of your depth, a cry from the depths, the darkness of the depths, which we can't stop there, can we? We must go on. In verse 4, deliverance from the depths. You notice all the D's, by the way. I am cooking on gas, as Barnaby said. So, depths. The cry from the depths, the darkness of the depths. And now deliverance from the depths. There is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. That word in the Hebrew that's translated forgive, apparently, is only used in respect of God himself. We do forgive after a sort, but true forgiveness actually originates from God. The Pharisees were right, weren't they? Do you remember that time when those four friends let that man down through the roof? They broke up the roof and let him down. That paralyzed man. And everybody was thinking, oh, Jesus is going to heal him. And Jesus looked at him, and what did he do? He said, son, your sins are forgiven. Far better than being healed. And what did the Pharisees say? In their hearts, they said, who can forgive sins but God alone? They were right. They just didn't recognize that God was there with them, that Jesus is God. But when God forgives, what does that mean? Does he just turn a blind eye? Does he say, oh, never mind, that's no big deal? I'm bigger than that. Does he do his best to ignore what you've done wrong or I've done wrong? How would you feel about that? If you look at the history of the world, if you look at things that are going on right now, how do you feel about that? If God said to all these people doing all these different things, oh, well, never mind. I'm bigger than that. I can turn a blind eye to all this stuff. How would you feel about that? So why should he turn a blind eye to your sin and mine? If you've ever done something seriously wrong, then your wife knows, or your husband knows, or your parents know, or your boss knows, and you know they know, and they know you know they know, but no one says anything. There's just this uneasy, unspoken sort of this silence about this, but anybody knows it's there, and no one yet has broached the subject. Nothing's mentioned for days on end, and perhaps for a little while you forget, then suddenly you remember, oh yes, it's still there. No one's spoken about this. Is it going to come up? It haunts because it's not been properly dealt with and forgiven. You see, forgiveness does not mean that God does not treat our sin seriously. He very much does. And he deals with it thoroughly in a way that properly, forever clears the air so that we can relate to him properly. That, as the psalmist says there in verse 4, he may be feared. If there's no proper forgiveness, you can't truly fear God in the biblical sense. That deep, reverent respect and love, you can't. You'll just live in unease, dread, terror, suspicion of God, hatred even towards him, if forgiveness is not properly expressed to you. There won't be that loving respect, that thrilling awe in his presence, if there's no forgiveness. So what is forgiveness? When he says there is forgiveness, what does he mean? Well, that word means pardon. Do you know what pardon means? Have you ever heard of anybody getting a royal pardon? Someone's being found guilty in the courts of the land, or a presidential pardon. It happens sometimes in other countries too, where there isn't a king or queen. And the person is actually guilty. But they appeal for pardon, for mercy. And sometimes a pardon will be granted. Now, the pardon doesn't say, well, you didn't do that. The pardon says, you very much did do that, and you were going to be punished. You might even be going to lose your life. But the king or the queen or the president says, you'll be pardoned. The conviction's not been overturned. The judgment that what was done wrong hasn't been turned on its head. No, it was definitely wrong. It definitely merited punishment. The offense is still regarded as very serious, because if someone else does it, they're going to face exactly the same sentence. But sentence doesn't fall on this person who appeals for a royal pardon, for a presidential pardon. And it's interesting to note too, a presidential pardon can be revoked before it's been accepted. But once it's accepted, that's it. It's not revoked. Have you received a royal pardon and accepted it? But you just need to look on. To build up this idea of forgiveness, we just need to go to the end of the psalm, to verse 7, where he says, "Oh, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption." This fills out our idea of what's involved in forgiveness. That word, the two words, steadfast love, mercy, sometimes translated, is from a Hebrew word which is so rich, but one of the things it really means is a covenant love, an absolute committal, loyalty, but it's formal as well. There's an absolute loyal commitment It's binding. God binds himself by an eternal promise, a covenant. And that's the sort of thing of which, even of which marriage is meant to be a picture, a small reflection. But go beyond that too, because in the second half of the verse, it's not only just this covenant love, he says, plentiful redemption. He will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Redemption, that's the other idea that's involved in forgiveness. See, that word literally means to sever or release. He's going to release you from your iniquities. It also means to ransom. You know what happens when someone's ransomed, don't you? Someone's been kidnapped and someone pays a ransom and buys the person back. Well, there was in the Old Testament a prophet called Hosea or Hosea. And God told him to marry this rather notorious woman called Gomer. And she turned out to be very unfaithful. She was immoral. She was an adulterous woman. She was a whore. She deserted Hosea. But you know what? God said, go and get her back. Amazingly. And Hosea found her in the slave market. And he bought her back. And he said, you must come home with me and don't go away again. Stay with me. No more adultery, no more prostitution. I've ransomed you. I've delivered you. I've severed you from that lifestyle. I've ransomed you. I bought you back. And that's a picture, this Redeemer, of how God deals with us. Jesus, at the cost of his own life, with his precious blood, redeems us. God himself, at the cost of his own son, redeems sinners to himself. And he lays on Jesus our iniquities. And then he says to you and me, but stay with me. I've delivered you. I've severed you from your iniquities. So you can see what it is. Forgiveness faces up to the reality of our iniquities. It doesn't say, oh, it doesn't matter. It's costly. It's so costly. The redemption, the forgiveness is so costly that Jesus, as he was going to the cross, when he was in Gethsemane, he said, look, Father, if it's possible for this to happen, may it not be happening to me. That's how awful it was. He was so distressed, he began to be exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. The sorrows themselves were enough to destroy his human life. That's how expensive, how costly. And yet to us, it's free. And it's sure and certain. And you know, it means every last secret, every last guilty secret is dealt with. But it also means turning our back on them simple ways. And if you're not prepared to turn your back on them, if it says you don't want forgiveness, you just want an excuse. And there's a world of difference. This forgiveness is freely available to those who cry out for it. Have you done so? You know, you haven't got to be very old to cry out to God for forgiveness. There's no age limit. You haven't got to be 18. You can do it when you're 6 or 7 or 8, 4. I don't know how old John the Baptist came into this world already trusting in the Lord Jesus. But the point I'm making is there's no age limit downward, and there's no age limit upwards either. There's no one too old to cry out for forgiveness. Have you done what that man did in the parable we read at the start? Have you ever said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner? Well, we're nearly finished. Just 2 more D's as we wrap up very, very, very rapidly. We could spend another sermon looking at the second half, but just to recognize this, there's a determination in verses 5 and 6, and then there's a declaration in verses 7 and 8. The determination, my soul waits for the Lord, it says in the New King James. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. More than watchmen for the morning. He's saying, I wait, and I wait, and I wait for the Lord. I hang on to his word. You know, if your sin is serious to you, if you really want forgiveness, you'll let nothing come between you and God and his word, especially his word of forgiveness. Nothing. You'll wait for that. I don't know if the soldiers amongst us have had the experience of being a sentry on a really dark night and you're waiting and waiting and waiting for dawn. I don't mean a woman, I mean dawn, the morning light. You know, you're waiting. I know what it's like to be ill at night and you're waiting for morning. Do you know what it's like? You just, oh, wish morning would come. You might imagine what it's like. You're there, you're watching out, watching. You don't know whether you'd be more excited if an enemy came or just it's boring there being all night, or whether you're scared to death and you just want the day to come. But the point is, you want morning to come and you're yearning for it. And this man is saying, nothing is more important to me than that I should hear God's word of forgiveness and mercy, that I should know that my relationship with him is reestablished in Jesus Christ. Does that describe you? That's what I'm asking. Can you say, that's me? Or are you someone, oh, you just come and go. Yeah, it's nice to hear a few sermons. It's all right. You know, it's okay. It's comforting sometimes. Sometimes it's a bit awkward, but it's all right. And I come back next week if I want to. And if not, well, or I can come in here and just let it wash over me and go and come and go week after week after week. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, does your soul wait intensely? Is nothing more important to you than that you should know you're forgiven? And then there's a declaration. Because in verse 7, he says, "O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption." Is it if he's saying to his fellow human beings, particularly Israelites here he's talking to, on the basis of experience, he's saying, look, I cried and God heard me. I was terribly troubled and guilty because of my sin, but God through his word told me how I could be forgiven, redeemed through the sacrifice of his son. And he has plentiful redemption. There's no sort of sin and no amount of sin that I confessed before him that he wouldn't forgive, that he wouldn't redeem me from. And I want you to know that too. Do you encourage people? If you're a Christian, do you encourage people with that thought? You can tell them there's no amount of sin that God won't redeem them from if they cry out to him for forgiveness. If your experience is the same as this man, you'll be very eager that others of your fellow human beings, whoever they may be, get lifted out of the depths, out of the pit of sin, and know the relief of total forgiveness. You'll want them to know about Jesus. You want to tell them about Jesus who paid for your redemption. So there we are. Out of your depths, the cry from the depths, the darkness of the depths, deliverance from the depths. And out of that, there's going to be a determination to wait for God and a declaration to others of how he's forgiven you. Amen. Let's sing 505. 505.